the Katy Commissioner and served for many years as a site visitor and site visitor chair. He is also tenured associate professor in the School of Health and Rehabilitation Sciences at The Ohio State University, where he has served as the director of the Division of Athletic Training since 2000. He has been recognized for extensive contributions to the athletic training profession in both scholarship and leadership. His honors and awards include the Ohio State University School of Health and Rehabilitation Sciences Faculty Research and Faculty Service Awards, the Indiana State University Athletic Training Outstanding Young Professional Award, the Journal of Athletic Training's Outstanding Manuscript Award 3 times, the GLADA Outstanding Educator Award, being named an NATA Fellow and earning the NATA's Most Distinguished Athletic Trainer Award. He holds a bachelor's degree in exercise science and athletic training from the University of Toledo, a master's degree in athletic training from Indiana State University, and a doctorate in exercise physiology from the University of Toledo. Dr. Merrick is always welcome at SPATS, and we are always excited to hear his presentations. We appreciate your cooperation. We welcome Dr. Mark Merrick via telephone.
Thank you, everybody. First, greetings from the Buckeye State. I'm very sorry that I'm not able to be there with you. I'm certainly there in spirit, and I tried really hard yesterday to be there in presence as well. But one canceled flight, and then the backup flight with a 5-hour delay got me into Dallas at 10 o'clock last night with my next plane leaving just as I got to the gate. So I turned around and came home. So I am presenting from home this morning. It's a little bit different from me. I will apologize ahead of time if any of my four-legged co-presenters here at the house decide to contribute to this talk. So the talk today is Beyond Cold, whole body cryotherapy, chambers, fad or future. And I'm sure a lot of you have seen or heard or been asked something about these whole body cryotherapy chambers. They're certainly growing in popularity. We don't know a lot about them, particularly in the U.S. yet. And I thought this would be a great opportunity to maybe tell you a little bit about what we do know and to at least, if nothing else, make you conversant enough that you can talk with your patients and your athletes when they have questions. So here we go. Disclosures. I have had some disclosures relative to this topic. I recently spoke at the Future of Football Medicine Conference in Barcelona on this topic of whole body cryotherapy. And my travel for that conference was paid for by Air Products Incorporated, who is a company who makes whole body cryotherapy equipment. I'd also like to take a quick moment to thank everyone at SPATS. My heart is certainly with you, and it tears me up to not be able to be on the island today. I'll certainly miss seeing everybody at the reception tonight, but it's always a pleasure, and I consider everyone in the Valley as family. Shameless plug. As you heard, I'm also the president of the Katy, and you may or may not be aware that there's a very important event happening with the Katy right now. We have been working for the last couple of years on new educational standards for professional athletic training programs. We have them in a near final form, and they have the final open comment period for these is currently open right now. These include both operational standards for programs as well as the educational content standards. Operational programs standards includes things like where your program has to be housed, how many faculty you need to have. But I think for this audience today, most people will be more interested in the educational content. And I would highly encourage you to go take a look at that document and to provide some comment, because there are some major things that are in here that we've never had in our educational standards before. Those would include things like wound closure, which might include suturing, reduction of dislocations, obtaining patient test samples, including phlebotomy, administering medications that are prescribed by your physicians, and more. A lot of these are skills that athletic trainers have been using on isolated basis throughout the country, but we've never had a common set of educational standards for them before. We've proposed them now. So please take a look and provide some comment. That's open through July 31. If you just go to the Katy website, the very first banner you will see is what you see in the bottom left here. Just click on that and it will take you to the open comment period. So thank you for that shameless plug opportunity. So here we go. Cryotherapy. Here in the United States, when we use the word cryotherapy, we are really talking about something that's different than what they mean in Europe. And that became very apparent to me when I was speaking at the football medicine conference. So a little bit of background. When we talk, I'm sorry, next slide. I keep forgetting to advance the slides. I'm advancing them on my computer. So we should be at the slide that says, what do we mean when we say cryotherapy? So when we talk about cryotherapy here in the United States, we typically mean the localized application of cold. And we do that primarily as an intervention for acute musculoskeletal trauma. So we're using this in response to injury, whether those be sprains, strains, fractures, dislocations, those kinds of things. We also sometimes use cryotherapy to facilitate early exercise during rehabilitation. And this is to overcome a neurologic problem rather than to deal with the typical reasons we would use cryotherapy. We are seeing an increased use right now of cryotherapy for recovery from strenuous exercise. Your team may be using things like ice baths after practice, for example. More often than not, that's still a localized application where we're just doing the exercise muscle groups or joints. So maybe lower extremity ice baths. Only recently in this country have we started using the word cryotherapy to mean whole body cryotherapy, which we'll talk about here today. Whole body cryotherapy clinics are becoming more common. In fact, they are more common in the United States than anywhere else in the world. We have over 500 of them in the U.S. right now. Next slide. So these dollars are what we think of as athletic trainers when we talk about cryotherapy. Certainly localized application in response to a specific injurious process. Next slide. Our rationale for that, and if you were at SPAS last year, you heard me expound on this a little bit more, but cryotherapy for acute injury, we've also used it to suppress pain and edema. Please forgive me just one moment. Sorry about that. My dogs are eager to speak to you this morning. They're both really little, but they're very noisy. So for acute injury, we try to suppress pain and edema. We've all done that, and you're all very familiar with using that. There was a time when we thought that cryotherapy would actually increase blood flow if we left it on too long. So you may have heard of cold-induced vasodilation. We know that that's a myth. It does not actually happen. So that's not an appropriate rationale to use cryotherapy. Really, the bigger rationales are really about secondary injury. When we talk about an injury paradigm, primary injury is what we think of as our typical diagnosed injury. Things like sprains and strains and fractures and contusions. They're ultrastructural tissue damage. So I have damage to a tissue, either through strain or compression or any other kind of physical mechanism. And we can't change that. Much as I would like to, I just cannot undo this leg fracture you see in this photo here. In this secondary injury slide. The secondary injury piece is what happens when your body responds to the primary injury. And we believe secondary injury magnifies the amount of injury that you have. And when you have more injury, it takes you longer to clean up the mess, and therefore it also takes you longer to recover, repair, and return to function. So an early and commonly used rationale for cryotherapy is to suppress secondary injury, where the more I limit it, the less total injury I have, and that hopefully speeds me along in the process. In Knight's classic paper on this, we had secondary hypoxic injury and secondary enzymatic injury. And more recent updates to this really are about immune-mediated injury. That secondary injury is going to come through the immune system. Next slide. We know that secondary injury is real. In fact, this is some work of mine from my own lab. And what we know is that if you are injured, we see a loss of function in your mitochondria, and it's trackable over the first 5 hours. But I know that if I apply ice immediately, we don't lose that function. We retain the function and therefore have better tissue viability. So most of this is still pretty familiar. This is our classic rationales for cryotherapy. On the rehab side, people use cryotherapy to facilitate early exercise. And the goal behind that is through reversing arthritic neuromuscular inhibition. And if you're on the local cryotherapy rationale slide, that photo in the bottom left was really hard for me to find. But if anybody recognizes the person who's there using the isokinetic device as the subject, that's the Valley's own Bertha de la Garza from her master's work. But arthrogenic neuromuscular inhibition is where your nervous system inhibits your ability to use your musculature following an injury. And we know that if we put cryotherapy on an injured person, we can overcome that neuromuscular inhibition and allow you to exercise at a higher level and do so sooner than you might otherwise. So that's a really valuable use, and I think it's underutilized. Next slide. This next slide is one from my talk last year, and I have it here to point out that right now cryotherapy in the United States is somewhat controversial, at least in the press. And there are some self-proclaimed experts out there, I love to call them internet experts, who are really touting that ice is a bad idea following injury. And as we talked about last year, that's probably an oversimplification, and if you're using cryotherapy in the correct way, which is early, then you're probably doing it well. If you're using cryotherapy exclusively for rehab or exclusively for treatment for an ongoing basis, you're probably missing the boat. And that's really borne out in some of the literature. So next slide. There's some questionable evidence for local cryotherapy, and a lot of these use old data, but a lot of times we haven't studied these very well, and we haven't used a consistent approach to cryotherapy. And the one I recommend for injury typically is use of ice in the first 5 or 6 hours, and then I quit using the ice because we don't want to interfere with the wrong portion of inflammation. Next slide. So you should be on a slide that says inflammatory leukocytosis. It's a 3-color graph. And on the left-hand side of that, you see a big yellow spike at polynuclear cells. Polynuclear cells are also called polymorphonuclear cells, but more commonly we call them neutrophils. And they're the first immune cell population that shows up when you have an acute trauma. That's the group that we want to suppress with injury-related cryotherapy. And by doing so, we can limit your total amount of damage. The things we don't want to suppress are the next 2 piles of cells that you see there a couple of days later in this particular slide, the monos. The monos are monocytes. Monocytes become macrophages when they get out into the tissue, and they coordinate the repair and the cleanup process. Early cryotherapy during the neutrophil phase makes a lot of sense physiologically. Cryotherapy in the monocyte phase, certainly much less so. So what I'm teaching my students now is that we use ice really in the first 5 or 6 hours, and then we stop. So with all that background and familiarity that you already know about cryotherapy, let's move on to the next slide, and let's start talking about this new thing. So whole body cryotherapy, hype and hope is greater than evidence. And that's really the take-home message of this talk. I hope that if you get nothing else, you'll have some idea of the difference between the hype and the evidence, and a little bit about how you might be able to use that. So next slide. You should be on a slide that is a lovely picture of me and a few other folks in a panel discussion. This is actually in the press room at FC Barcelona at the Camp Nou in Barcelona at the Football Medicine Conference when we were doing this talk. And I show you this because it was a really fun talk, but more than anything else, some of the next slides I'm going to show you are actually from a couple of my colleagues in this talk. We broke up the topics there where I talked about the clinical application, and my good friend and colleague Giuseppe Banfi from Milan, Italy, talked more about the physiology. Professor Banfi is the leader of probably the world's #1 lab who's studying these kinds of things right now. So next slide. So on this slide, it says whole body cryotherapy. You should have a whole lot of pictures of folks who are in whole body cryotherapy chambers. And if you notice, there are probably some people that you recognize. Certainly LeBron James there in the top middle, Shaq. Bottom left is Floyd Mayweather. Guy in the bottom right is actually one of the performers from Cirque du Soleil. But this is really big with professional athletes and performers right now, to the point where if you're not doing it, or if you haven't tried it, then you're not in the know. And that's the way a lot of these new kinds of treatments work. They become popularized because high-performing, well-known athletes have tried them, and there's some photo on the internet, just like these, that make your athletes say, well, you know what? If LeBron's doing it, maybe I should be doing this too. In the bottom center here, you also see an image that I pulled from one of the cryotherapy clinics that's out there. And you see that they're doing a lot of different claims related to these things. That it's good for headaches, weight loss, blemishes, anxiety, inflammation, recovery, pain, stress, fibromyalgia. Those kinds of claims always give me pause. Whenever there's one treatment out there that cures darn near everything that we're having a hard time treating, it usually doesn't. And usually you have a lot of hype and not a lot of evidence. So let's take a look. In the United States, we have more access to whole body cryotherapy, next slide, than you do anywhere else in the world. Certainly, as I've mentioned, professional sports teams in basketball primarily, American football, baseball, hockey, UFC fighters are using it a lot. The Olympic teams are starting to experiment with this. We, in our professional sports culture, tend to be early adopters of virtually anything that's new or interesting. And that's because we largely, at those levels, have the wealth to invest in the equipment. A whole body cryotherapy chamber is going to cost you somewhere north of $60,000. And a lot of folks aren't going to have those, but the professional sports teams, $60,000 is smaller than anybody's signing bonus on the team. So, they have the resources to try to go after those kinds of things. However, what we also tend to see is that although they have resources, they're not often very discriminating about if their evidence to support the use. So they tend to try things and see if their athletes like them and if they feel like they're getting any benefits. So there's a lot of anecdotal things there. In the U.S., we also have a lot of cryotherapy clinics. And cryotherapy clinics are rapidly increasing in number across the country. Last count that I made, we came across over 540 of them in the United States. These clinics are third-party providers, and you go there, you make an appointment, you pay a fee, and you go use the equipment, and sometimes you can buy package deals where you can use the equipment so many times over a certain period, or sometimes you pay by the individual use. There's a lot of ways that they market them in terms of the financial side. The clinics also tend to be the worst offenders about the misinformation. They make astounding claims about what whole body cryotherapy can do for you. And understand that they're trying to attract paying customers, and the literature does not always support the things that you're hearing the clinics advertise. In fact, I'll mention it here in a few minutes, but the FDA just had an announcement on the FDA website this year in response to these and in response to these claims. Next slide. So hype. I've got some quotes here that I've pulled from a variety of sources from athletes and their beliefs about whole body cryotherapy. I really love the first one. I think this is hilarious. One athlete compared it to standing in a giant Red Bull can with your head poking out. They tend to believe that this makes you feel energized. It gives you wings, just like Red Bull, except they got sued because it didn't give you wings. But athletes like the feeling when they come out of here. Another quote, they were stepping out of the device essentially with instant recovery effects. I'm terribly skeptical about anything that uses the word instant in front of something like recovery, because it never really works that way. But that's what the athletes believe. They believe that if I get in here, the minute I get out, I'm really good to go. And that this might help me in something like a multi-games over a couple days format, like, say, a wrestling tournament or a tennis tournament, or something like a multi-game series in the playoffs like we see in professional sports. So they're always looking for something that will do this kind of thing and give them instant boost and instant recovery. The third quote here, every single athlete that we worked with told us it produced a change, it produced a recovery like they hadn't felt. And I think there's a really important thing here. The feeling when you come out of this is something that is tangible. A lot of the treatments that we use, the athlete doesn't actually feel anything and we're kind of taken for granted whether or not it actually does anything physiologically. This treatment you cannot help but notice. It's extraordinarily cold. Anybody who does it will be shivering within seconds of when you do it. So it's a really big shock sensory-wise to you. And when you get out and you recover, you start to warm back up, you do feel a little bit different. You feel a little refreshed, a little energized, not unlike the sauna to the ice water baths that was popular in Northern Europe. So the athletes like it because they feel something. And they equate feeling something with this helps me to recover. Next slide. Here's some more hype. A single session of cryotherapy is enough for, here's my favorite word again, instant relief from, let's see what they say, inflammation and soreness, good for an energy boost that lasts you the rest of the day. There's no evidence actually to support the rest of the day piece, although there is some interesting evidence that you sleep well. After you've done these things, you tend to sleep very well that night. But, the rest of the quote here, 3 minutes of treatment and you're on your way to pain relief and a productive day. And the graphic from the bottom here is from another one of the cryotherapy clinics, trying to expand the market they're using. We think about the sports and fitness and health and wellness markets principally. You see they make claims about fatigue and soreness and inflammation and recovery, certainly about pain, and there's some good evidence about pain as well. But the beauty and spa piece I find interesting. Not a lot of great evidence there, but you're seeing some growing use for beauty purposes for these things. Next slide. So next slide. We're taking skin surface temperatures to 30 degrees in less than a minute, which is absolutely true. But what comes after as an explanation for what happens doesn't quite fit the physiology. The body gives up trying to regulate skin surface temperature. It draws blood to the core. That might be true. There's some evidence there. This next piece, though, is just totally made up. When the blood is in the core, it picks up oxygen and nutrients since the body feels like it's in massive distress. Well, yes, your blood does pick up oxygen and nutrients when it's in the core, when it's in the organ circulation, but it doesn't really happen more so with this treatment than it does during normal situations. And recovery is not limited by oxygenation nor nutrient uptake. We have plenty of those things that already happen in normal physiology. Next slide. So some more hype. Mentioned the cosmetic and aesthetic thing, and this is again an image that I pulled off of a cryotherapy website. I find it interesting that it will fix all of these parts of your body that you're concerned don't look the way that you'd like them to. Again, there's not really a lot of evidence that it does any of those things, but anything that will get customers in the door. But the arthritis, fibromyalgia, and migraines piece also looks a little interesting. If you think about all three of those conditions, they are chronic conditions for which patients are seeking relief and not finding it. So the marketing for these devices is really going after people who are willing to try anything because nothing else is working for them. Next slide. So you should be on the FDA cautionary slide. It says 2016 FDA cautionary statement about whole body cryotherapy. With the growing number of clinics in the United States, the FDA has now become concerned about some of those claims that I've just showed you over the last few slides. Whole body cryotherapy is not FDA approved as a treatment for any medical condition within the United States. Not necessarily because there's no evidence to support its use. I believe that there is. But it's not approved because no company has gone through the FDA approval process for use as a medical device. So in the U.S., you can use these devices, but they're not considered medical treatments. And as long as I don't claim it's a medical treatment, I can use just about anything. And the fines are usually small enough that a lot of companies flirt with claiming medical claims about devices. And if they get fined by the FDA, that's still only a small piece out of their profits, and they can still be profitable. But in the FDA piece, and if you just go to the FDA website and you put in whole body cryotherapy, you'll be able to find this release to read it yourself. There's a nice PDF you can download. It explains a little bit about what it is, but what it says is there's insufficient evidence to describe the benefits. I don't know that I entirely agree with that. I think there's a growing body of literature that describes at least the biochemistry of this reasonably well, but there's not a lot of great literature out there that talks about clinical efficacy, and I think that's really what the FDA is talking about. The FDA also cautions against risks. These devices have risks, just like any other device that you might use, and we'll talk a little bit about those. So next slide. Whole body cryotherapy related death. In the United States, there is one, to my knowledge, death that has been attributed to a whole body cryotherapy treatment. It happened in 2015, and it actually happened in Las Vegas. The woman was Hawaiian, but it didn't happen in Hawaii. A Hawaii woman freezes to death after apparently getting locked inside a cryotherapy chamber. You see here from the quote, she was found inside a chamber at least 10 hours after she entered it. These things are really, really cold, and in 10 hours, you are going to be frozen stiff. This person would not have frozen to death. Instead, what really probably happened is the bottom line here. She was operating the machine without assistance and may have suffocated. So let me explain that a little bit. The person who died was an employee of the cryotherapy clinic, and after the clinic closed, she used the chamber herself after hours with nobody else there. Big, big, big mistake. You never, ever use these devices by yourself without an operator. And that operator really should be trained in safety procedures for how to do it. And one of the biggest reasons for that is that the most common form of these use liquid nitrogen directly in the chamber with you to cause the cooling. And that liquid nitrogen in room temperatures immediately turns into nitrogen gas. And you can have so much nitrogen gas that you can suffocate if you're not careful and if somebody's not monitoring the treatment. So there is certainly a risk. There haven't been a lot of adverse events, a few frostbites here and there, only one death that I know about. Next slide. So types of whole body cryotherapy. This is going to really relate very much to that safety piece I just talked about. Next slide. So you should have a slide, excuse me, that says cryosauna direct versus cryopod indirect. And there are really two kinds of equipment on the marketplace. One is called a cryosauna, and I have direct because it uses liquid nitrogen in the chamber itself to do the cooling. And the other type of device is called a cryopod, and it says indirect because it does not use liquid nitrogen in the chamber with the patient. Next slide. The first picture I have here are cryosaunas. And if you look at all three of these photos, you've got LeBron in the top right, and you have some model wearing gloves in the bottom right, and then another model over there on the tall one on the left. Look at the equipment. Look at the shape of the equipment, the piece above the participant's head, and you realize these are all the same device. This is probably the most common of the cryosauna devices available in the U.S., and most of the cryosaunas that are out there actually spray liquid nitrogen right into the chamber, and it causes massive cooling because it's extremely cold. But again, there's a suffocation risk there because it can displace the oxygen in the chamber. It can push it up and out, and the whole chamber can be oxygen-free, and you can suffocate, which is why the photo on the left here, you see how tall that chamber is, and you see how it's actually taller than the model? Now, if you look at the two photos on the right, you realize that both LeBron and this other patient, their head and shoulders are really up out of the chamber. And that's a modification that company made to try to improve some safety. So they're making the chambers shorter, and they've retrofitted some of the older chambers with a platform inside that you could stand on so that your head is not actually in the chamber. So technically, on those devices, you're no longer getting whole body cryotherapy. You're actually getting partial body cryotherapy because it's really from the shoulders down, so that your head is free into an area where you have room air available, so that you don't have that suffocation risk to the same extent. Next slide. Next slide is the cryopod. Excuse me. The cryopod is an indirect method. Again, disclaimer here, the cryopod is produced by the company who flew me over to Spain to talk about these things. The way the cryopod works is it's been developed by a company called Air Products. Air Products makes refrigeration equipment for doing things like freezing shrimp off the shrimp boats. They're around South Padre, and a lot of food production facilities. They sell gases, and they're just getting into this particular market, but one of the features that they wanted to do before they got in was they wanted to have a piece of equipment that never put the liquid nitrogen directly in the same chamber with the patient. So what they do is they use liquid nitrogen to cool room air within their device, and then they pump that super cooled room air into the chamber with the patient. By doing so, they never have a suffocation risk with the chamber. So it's a little bit different approach. In my view, I think it's a refinement of the approach because I think it's safer for the patient because there is no suffocation risk with this kind of equipment. Next slide. These devices need to have some safety procedures, and the most important of them is protective clothing while you're in the chamber. The temperatures that are in these chambers are well below -200 Fahrenheit. In fact, usually they're below -250 Fahrenheit, between -250 and 300 in most cases. And parts of you that have lower levels of blood flow and that are large surface area to small mass, like your fingers and the tips of your ears, are potentially at risk for cold injury while you're in these chambers. So while you're in there, the patient should be wearing a pair of gloves, typically thermal socks or booties, something that covers the feet, some manner of undergarments. Sometimes you'll just wear some shorts or sports bra kind of thing. And typically ear protection if you're using a chamber where you actually cool the head so that you don't get the ears overly cool. So those things will protect you from frostbite on the areas that are most susceptible to that. The next really important thing, and this is where most of the adverse events have come from, is nothing wet can ever go into the chamber. It is cold enough that anything that's wet will freeze almost instantly. So if I go in there and I'm still sweaty because I've just come in off the court or off the field, if I get in this chamber, the perspiration on my skin can freeze. And that can actually cause me to have a cold injury. Other things that you have to watch are, if you've washed those gloves or those thermal socks between patients and they're still a little bit damp, they will freeze in the chamber and you can injure somebody with that. So everything has to be dry. And they also typically have a set of health contraindications. They don't want to use these on people who have significant cardiovascular compromise, for example. Next slide. So this slide is three of the cryopod devices, and I took this while I was over in Europe. This was actually at the Manchester Institute of Health and Performance, as you can see there. And that's really a sports performance center that's funded by the government and by an insurance company over in the UK, works with a lot of their Olympic athletes. And they actually have a facility where they've got multiple of these so they can try to get large teams through in a short period of time. Most places where you will see them, they'll have a single chamber, and that may limit the throughput that you have on trying to treat multiple patients. But at the price point, it's hard to have a lot of these, so it's hard to treat large groups. There are at least one manufacturer who makes a very large multi-person cold chamber where you could put a group in there. And I know some European rugby teams are currently using that and testing it. Next slide. Typical treatment protocol. Excuse me. Usually 3 minutes in the chamber. And I did this, and I will tell you, 3 minutes is a long time at this cold. The first 60 seconds is kind of cute. And the middle 60 seconds, you're thinking, I'm really getting cold here, and this is starting to get uncomfortable, and you start shivering. And in that third minute, you are shivering significantly, and you can't stop yourself no matter how hard you try. Once you've done it once, and you know what you're going through, it's a little more tolerable the next time through. But your first time through, it's colder than you think it will be. Again, the temperatures are really cold. You are in them with minimal clothing, so you're not typically wearing shorts and a T-shirt. You want as much exposed skin as you can, but you don't want to expose anything you wouldn't want to get frostbitten. So protective equipment like shorts, sports bras are pretty important. I've already mentioned whole body versus partial body. A lot of the devices in the U.S. now are doing partial body because they leave your head and shoulders out for safety purposes. If you're using the cryopod equipment, you can actually do whole body with your head in there because it's room air and there's no suffocation risk. Next slide. So the physiology of whole body cryotherapy. There's a lot of hype, there's a lot of claims. What do we know? What have we measured in the laboratory that these things actually do? Next slide. The slide you see here says whole body cryotherapy in athletes from therapy to stimulation, an updated review of the literature. This is an update of the paper that's referenced down at the bottom. You see in 2010, Banfi et al. Did a literature review on this. And we've learned a lot in the last 7 years. The article up at the top is if you're looking for one-stop shopping to learn as much as you can about what these do, that's the one article you want to read. Because it really does a comprehensive look at all the literature that's out there and categorizes the findings and explains a little bit of the mechanisms and a little bit of how you might use that clinically. So probably the best review paper out there is the Lombardi et al. Paper. So if you're looking for one-stop shopping, there's a good plug for you to look at. Next slide. So the proposed mechanism, and again, this next series of slides have been used with permission from my colleague Giuseppe Banfi over in Italy. There are really two proposed mechanisms by which whole-body cryotherapy alters your physiology. The first one you see here, and it starts out with cold stimulus you see in the red box. And for now, we're going to forget the arrow that goes over to collagenases and MMP. I'll talk about that in a moment. But if you look, it says cold receptors and afferent nerve CNS. The first mechanism for whole-body cryotherapy action is a neurologic mechanism. And that neurologic mechanism is pretty profound. If I get you that cold that fast, it causes a significant sensory stimulus, and it actually triggers an efferent sympathetic nervous system response. Next slide. That efferent sympathetic response affects your immune system, and it suppresses the activity of the mast cell and its release of histamine. And the mast cell is really a trigger for other inflammatory processes. It doesn't do anything to fight inflammation itself other than call in other processes to come in and do things with inflammation. But it also affects the macrophage. And I don't pretend that this audience all have PhDs in biochemistry, so I'm not going to run through all the different alphabet soup of different inflammatory mediators here. But the Reader's Digest version is that there's significant suppression of a lot of pro-inflammatory signals. And when we have inflammation following exercise, the way inflammation is regulated, it is up-regulated by some signals, and it is down-regulated by others. And those always exist in concert. So at the same time, I have up-regulatory signals and down-regulatory signals at the same time. And whichever one I have the most of is what I get. So if I have more up-regulatory signals, I get more inflammation. If I have more down-regulatory signals, I suppress the inflammation. The sympathetic nervous system response to whole-body cryotherapy causes a pretty significant down-regulatory signaling pathway that comes out of your immune system. And by doing so, it changes the balance of up-regulation versus down-regulation, and the net result is I get suppression of inflammatory mechanisms. That can also affect some other things in addition to inflammation. It can affect things like blood vessel diameter in the vessels who have muscular walls, so arterioles and venules and those types of things. And it can actually cause a little constriction there which may also suppress a little bit of inflammatory action. Next slide. So you should be on a slide where the red box is around cold stimulus and then a little extension down that says collagenases, MMP, and PGE2. This is a different mechanism. This is not a neurologic mechanism. This is a direct temperature regulatory mechanism on the activity of enzyme. You probably recall from your physiology classes that almost all of human physiology is dependent upon enzymatic activity. The effectors of most of your systems use enzymes to cause biochemical change because the reactions that are there would happen too slowly for you to live. Enzymes speed up the rate of those reactions by a factor of at least 10,000. We know that if I reduce the environmental temperature around that enzyme, that I suppress its activity. So I know that if I get you cold, I can suppress the activity, and these particular enzymes are pro-inflammatory, and they are also pro-damage. So when I have an injury, like exercise-induced muscle damage or delayed onset muscle soreness, as we often call it in our country, these enzymes are released and they cause tissue damage. We know that if I get you cold, I can suppress the activity of these, and that's kind of valuable. What we don't know is does getting your skin cold suppress these in other places? And it's possible, but that's yet unshown. Next slide. So the main effects of whole-body cryotherapy really fall in three areas. Analgesia, which is pain relief. Certainly there's a gate control component to that. That's pretty significant. We also have anti-inflammatory activity. And the anti-inflammatory activity, both at decreasing enzyme activities as well as some of the signaling through the neurologic mechanisms is important. We also know that whole-body cryotherapy can decrease edema and bleeding, but that's really a sort of a tertiary purpose. They're probably not getting cold enough other than the skin just to do that. Next slide. So here's what happens at the skin. Skin temperature during whole-body cryotherapy drops. And this graph shows you both the black squares are whole-body cryotherapy, and the white circles are cold water immersion. That's cold water tubs that we put somebody into. And what you'll notice is that when we immediately put you in it, the whole-body cryotherapy drops your skin temperature further than cold water immersion does. It's probably the magnitude of that temperature change that is the stimulus for most of the effect. I get some of these effects out of cold water immersion, but not nearly to the same level that I do out of whole-body cryotherapy. Once you get out, the skin temperature recovery looks the same on both. Next slide. Here we have core temperature during whole-body cryotherapy. And to translate this for you, you've got sort of 5 temperature times here. The first one is a pre-treatment. The second one from the left is once you finish your whole-body cryotherapy treatment. You see your core temperature is going to drop about 0.2 degrees Celsius while you're in the chamber. So while your skin temperature dropped quickly, your core temperature changed at most around 0.2 degrees. So really not very important. Interestingly, though, about an hour after the treatment, your core temperature has actually continued to drop, where it gets down another tenth, maybe another 0.2 before it starts coming back up. I don't know that that means anything physiologically, other than you continue to cool for a little while afterward, but at no time is your core temperature drop big enough for you to get anything like hypothermia. But again, these treatments are short. They're 3 minutes in duration. Next slide. Adiposity makes a difference on your skin temperature change. Patients who are very lean with very little adipose tissue have a bigger skin temperature response than patients who are obese, which is actually a little bit of a surprising finding. We kind of thought the obese patient would cool faster because they have a layer of insulation where heat from the body can't get out to the skin. But that's actually not the way it works. The thin folks tend to cool a little bit faster. Again, I don't know if that means a whole lot, but certainly the thin folks may be less tolerant of these treatments. The obese folks may be a little more. They might actually need to go a little bit longer. Next slide. Okay, so there's some more alphabet soup. Effects of whole-body cryotherapy on oxidative stress. Given the time we have, I'm not going to do a big primer on what all of these measures are. I'm going to give you the short version, the clinical version. Redox status is how well you are able to survive oxidative stress. And we know that exercise causes oxidative stress, and a big piece of recovery is overcoming that. Whole body cryotherapy in professional rowers, one group had 6 days of training, the other group had whole body cryotherapy immediately before their training on each of those days. And they saw that the whole body cryotherapy group had significantly improved oxidative stress tolerance. They also have some increase in reactive, or limits the increase in reactive oxygen species. Again, another piece of the same thing. And there was less measure of muscle damage following that training as well. So it looks like pre-treatment with whole body cryotherapy may help to stave off some of the detrimental effects of exercise. Next slide. Inflammatory markers. Again, some more alphabet soup for you. Some of these markers are pro-inflammatory and some are anti-inflammatory. Top right column, you see IL-10. IL-10 is an anti-inflammatory signal, and whole body cryotherapy actually increases the anti-inflammatory signal. All the signals over on the left-hand side there are all pro-inflammatory, and whole body cryotherapy suppresses them. Again, this is probably through the neurological mechanism, but we can see that whole body cryotherapy suppresses blood measures of a lot of inflammatory signaling chemicals. Next slide. This slide more or less says a lot of the same things. Pro-inflammatory signals are suppressed, anti-inflammatory signals are strengthened. And interestingly, this is after 10 sessions, in some cases even up to 20 sessions. What we see is that the anti-inflammatory effects of whole body cryotherapy work best after a period of getting used to or having multiple treatments. A single treatment has measurable change, but once you've had about 10 treatments, you tend to have significant change in your inflammatory profile, and you better resist inflammation during exercise. So it looks like there may be a cumulative effect with these. So one-off treatments might be nice, but investing in the equipment and using it regularly looks like it may actually work a little bit better. Next slide. The recovery study. In this study, as you see, they took a blood sample to measure those different signals, did a little warm-up, then they kicked the rear end of some endurance runners with a flat hill, downhill, uphill 3-minute cycle for 45 minutes of running, and then looked at recovery over time after that. These 11 endurance athletes. The nice thing on this study is it's a crossover study. They did 2 trials with a 1-month washout in between. One of the trials, the order was randomized. They just did passive recovery. The other one, they did 4 sessions of whole body cryotherapy, so 4 daily sessions. And when they did so, next slide, what they saw was the inflammatory markers related to EIMD, is exercise-induced muscle damage. In the U.S., we sometimes call this DOMS. But all the inflammatory markers related to exercise-induced muscle damage were suppressed, or perhaps even in my colleagues' words, counteracted after even just a single session. So it looks like there may be something to recovering with these. From a biochemical standpoint, at least it changes the signal. Next slide. It also changes salivary androgen profile. So a single treatment reduces cortisol, reduces DHEA. A single treatment looks like it reduces testosterone and also reduces estradiol. Next slide. 7 days of using this daily, we see significant suppression of cortisol. And that's important because cortisol is implicated pretty heavily in overtraining. It's a stress hormone that we see higher and higher levels as you become overtrained. So suppressing it may help with overtraining. We also see that in almost all of the participants, 7 days of use actually increased free testosterone levels, which has an androgenic effect and may help with training as well. Next slide. All right, so here's the bottom line. Does this treatment work? I hate this question. If you advance, you'll get a little picture of a hammer with a screw here. I use this slide in almost every one of these talks that I do because it's a bad question. If we say, does whole body cryotherapy work? Well, I don't know what you mean. You have to understand that every tool in your toolbox is just that, it's a tool. If you use the tool for the right job, you get the outcome you're after. If you use the tool for the wrong job, you don't. Next slide. This is where the idea of evidence-based practice comes in. And while this talk is not an evidence-based practice talk, the principles still apply. For whole body cryotherapy, We have too little clinical expertise. And if you advance once, EVP will show up in the middle, and advance one more time, and you should have 3 arrows on the screen. Too little clinical expertise, too little best research evidence, and too much patient values and preferences. Our equation for evidence-based practice right here is not yet developed where it needs to be. There's a lot of hype and desire, and patients feel something, so they like it, but we don't have nearly enough clinical expertise to guide it for specific use very well. And the research evidence is really mostly about signaling, not about actual physical measures of recovery. Next slide. So here's a summary. Here's what we know that it does. Cooling of efficacy depends on your body composition. Leaner people cool faster. We know that whole body cryotherapy improves your antioxidant ability, your ability to resist oxidative stress damage following exercise. We know that it has a decidedly anti-inflammatory or inflammation suppressing effect on signaling. I didn't talk about irisin in this talk because we're a little limited on time. It has to do with a little bit of fat metabolism, and I'm going to leave that out for now. But we also see that the testosterone to cortisol ratio with training is improved by this. So if there's something here, does whole body cryotherapy hold some promise? The answer is, in my exercise physiology laboratory, I'm very interested in this. It changes a number of measures in a direction we would like to see them change. Next slide. But here's where we have the trouble. We must continue to have scientific and clinical evidence for this therapy. And currently, there's just no good clinical evidence about what this does to performance of your athlete patient. I can tell you what it does to their laboratory measures, but what it actually does to their performance is not yet documented. In the U.S., we're going to have to work with the FDA and do some high-quality randomized clinical trials to get approval to do this. And I'm actually talking with a company about maybe trying to do one of those in the next year or two. We'll see how that goes. And third, we have to replace the hype with evidence, which is an ongoing battle for us because our athletes ask us, and understanding what the evidence is useful, but the hype that they hear from other athletes is always going to be a lot more interesting and salacious than anything I can tell you from the laboratory. The laboratory take-home is this looks really interesting. It improves oxidative stress recovery. It improves on inflammation. It improves testosterone to cortisol in the laboratory in blood measures. But we don't have good performance data. Next slide. That brings us to the end. By the way, if you're interested, this is a lovely picture of one of the glaciers coming out of the Juneau ice field. I was just in Alaska 2 weeks ago for a cruise for my 25th anniversary. So with that, I'm just about out of time, so I will thank you very much. And I don't know if we can do questions in this format or not, but I'm willing to give it a try.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we do have a couple of questions. One is actually very funny. It says, wasn't Han Solo the first victim of cryotherapy?
Oh, I love that. The Star Wars geek in me thinks that's a great question. I think that he was maybe in the chamber a little too long, and he obviously was in the one with a little more cold than maybe you want.
And the second question is, have you ever personally used one of these devices, and what did you think, if you have?
So I have personally been